Hey guys! Today we're diving into another truly horrifying case. If you want to support my channel, make sure to subscribe and stay active. It really helps me out. I'd be super grateful for that. Let's get started. If a serious crime occurs but no physical evidence or even the whereabouts of the victim can be determined, forensic experts often rely on various investigative techniques to piece together what happened and hold those responsible accountable. In court, evidence may include witness testimonies, security camera footage, DNA analysis, crime scene reconstructions, and more. But what happens when none of these are available and all individuals involved have a history of addiction, criminal records, or even false identities that make the investigation even more challenging? The events of today's case took place in the late 1980s. But from the very beginning, authorities failed to give it the attention it deserved. Crucial evidence was lost, and key leads were overlooked, leaving gaps in the case that were never filled. The disappearance of Irene May remains unsolved to this day, largely due to serious investigative missteps. The young woman vanished without a trace, leaving behind nothing but unanswered questions, conflicting witness statements, and a series of unusual discoveries. Yet, none of it ever formed a complete picture, and the truth seems to have been buried forever. Irene May was born in April 1965 in the suburbs of Santa Maria and grew up in a difficult household. There is little information available about her family, but it is known that she ran away from home as a teenager and spent years moving between trailer parks and high-crime areas. At a young age, Irene was introduced to prohibited substances, and she quickly developed a dependency. By the age of 23, she was a mother of 3, but had lost custody due to the unstable lifestyle she was leading. Her husband, Bobby May, who was also the father of her children, was serving time in prison for a failed robbery attempt and was awaiting trial. Irene rented an apartment in the rundown town of Lifewalk Spring, where she lived with 2 acquaintances who also struggled with dependency issues and had previous run-ins with the law. At the time of the events in question, one of her roommates, 39-year-old Carrie Dalton, had recently been released from prison and was staying with her boyfriend, Mark Tompkins. The other roommate, Cheryl Baker, had also moved out, leaving Irene unable to afford the rent on her own, which put her at risk of eviction. Desperate to find temporary housing, Irene was actively searching for a job and consulting with a caseworker to understand what steps she needed to take to regain custody of her children. She was determined to turn her life around. She wanted to break free from her dependency, secure a stable, and, most importantly, legal source of income, rent a home, and reunite with her family. Cheryl, along with her boyfriend George, helped Irene move out and found her an affordable storage unit where she could temporarily keep her furniture, clothing, and other belongings. Meanwhile, she continued searching for a new place to stay, as she only had a couple of days left before she had to vacate her apartment. At this time, Carrie, who had not been to the apartment since her arrest, suddenly returned and was furious at what she saw. She quickly tracked down Cheryl and accused Irene of taking furniture that belonged to her and storing it in the unit. She also claimed that Irene had stolen her jewelry and demanded that Cheryl help her get it back. Carrie was livid, throwing around insults and threats. Cheryl, hoping to defuse the situation, promised to check Irene's storage unit for the missing items and let her know what she found. She kept her word, but didn't find anything. However, instead of calming Carrie down, this seemed to enrage her even more. She decided to confront Irene herself, convinced that her former roommate had stolen from her. When Carrie confronted Irene, she yanked her bag away, dumped its contents onto the sidewalk, and spotted a couple of bracelets that she immediately claimed as hers before taking them. Irene was shaken by her former roommate's aggressive behavior, but the harassment didn't stop there. Carrie continued to follow her, demanding that she return more belongings. Irene denied all accusations, insisting that she hadn't taken anything. The pressure from Carrie only escalated. She began making open threats and even accused Irene and her boyfriend Bobby, who was still in prison, of being informants for law enforcement. The conflict kept spiraling, but no one could have predicted the horrifying turn it was about to take. On the evening of June 26, 1988, Irene, Cheryl, and her boyfriend George went out to look for prohibited substances. They knew that someone selling them could usually be found near the corner of a local 24-hour store, so that's where they headed. Unexpectedly, Carrie and Mark pulled into the same parking lot, claiming that a mutual friend's car had been stolen. They suggested that everyone join in the search for the missing vehicle. All three agreed, and Irene saw this as an opportunity to smooth things over with Carrie. Unfortunately, she had no idea that everything had been carefully orchestrated with one goal in mind: to lure her into a deadly trap. They drove around the area until they ran into another acquaintance, Joan Feder, whose car had broken down on the road. Inside the vehicle were her son and daughter, ages 1 and 3. Carrie offered to tow her car back to the trailer park, and Joan agreed. In reality, this was exactly where Carrie had planned to bring Irene, and the situation provided a perfect excuse. Once Irene was inside, Carrie resumed accusing her of theft and of allegedly working as an informant. At first, it seemed like more of the same petty arguing, but Irene was never given a chance to defend herself. Carrie locked the trailer door to prevent her from leaving and ordered her to clean up, cook dinner for everyone, and wash the dishes afterward. Irene followed every command without resistance, still hoping they would eventually let her go. The others, Cheryl, Mark, and George, didn't interfere. They simply watched in silence as the situation unfolded. Later that night, Joan, who was in a neighboring trailer, overheard shouting about a syringe. It turned out that the group had been sharing the same injection tool for prohibited substances the previous night, but had only realized it that morning. The problem was that, according to some sources, Irene had been diagnosed with hepatitis, meaning the infection could have been transmitted to everyone through the unsterilized needle. This incident led to Irene being physically assaulted, but after that, Carrie seemed to calm down for a while. Around that time, Joan stopped by the trailer. She wasn't entirely sure what was going on, but she could tell that Irene was in danger. While Carrie was distracted, Joan quietly gave Irene instructions on how she could escape and urged her to take the first chance she got. Shortly after, Cheryl, George, and Joan left the trailer to take Joan's son and daughter to visit their father, who was serving time in a correctional facility in a nearby city. On their way back, Cheryl and her boyfriend made a stop to pick up substances for the group to use that evening. They were gone for about 3.5 hours. When they returned, they walked into a horrifying scene. Irene was tied to a chair, covered with a bedsheet that was stained in places with blood. Carrie and Mark appeared completely unfazed, acting as if nothing unusual had happened. Carrie calmly explained that Irene had attacked her, so they had to restrain her. Mark then took George outside to discuss their next steps, while Carrie led Cheryl into the bathroom and told her that Irene would not be leaving the trailer alive. Carrie pulled out several syringes filled with an unknown liquid and claimed that they contained battery acid, which they planned to inject into Irene's veins. She insisted that Cheryl take part in this, ensuring she would be implicated and unable to go to the police about what had happened. Cheryl was terrified. She knew exactly what Carrie was capable of, so she decided to comply with whatever she was told. As the two women approached Irene, attempting to inject her, she realized what was about to happen. Desperate, she begged for her life, pleading for mercy for the sake of her children. She fought back as best as she could, making it difficult for them to administer the injection as planned. Enraged, Carrie grabbed a syringe and forcefully stabbed it into Irene's leg, injecting the entire contents. As expected, it didn't take her life immediately, but instead caused excruciating pain. At that moment, Mark and George returned to the trailer, ready to finish what their partners had started. To keep Irene from screaming and attracting the attention of neighbors in the trailer park, they forced a bar of soap into her mouth as a gag. Mark looked around, picked up a hammer that was within reach, and struck Irene multiple times in the head and chest. Shockingly, she remained conscious. Seeing this, Carrie grabbed a heavy skillet from the kitchen and began smashing it against Irene's kneecaps. She continued striking her legs until the bones were completely shattered, but even that wasn't enough for her. Carrie and her boyfriend began tormenting Irene with electric shocks, pressing exposed wires against her skin. Then, Mark spent several minutes further mistreating her, stabbing different parts of her body with a screwdriver before deciding to end it. He grabbed a large knife from the kitchen and struck her multiple times in the chest. After that, Irene finally fell silent and showed no signs of life. After the brutal crime, the group focused on covering their tracks. Their top priority was making sure the body was never found. The men took on this task, and it's safe to say they executed it with disturbing efficiency. They wrapped the remains in a bedsheet, pulled a pickup truck right up to the trailer entrance, discreetly loaded the body into the truck bed, and set off for a nearby Native American reservation, bringing along an axe and a couple of shovels. The perpetrators dismembered the remains into multiple smaller parts and then spent hours driving through the remote desert, burying each piece separately to make any future search nearly impossible. Meanwhile, the women stayed behind, meticulously scrubbing the trailer to remove all traces of the crime. Every stained item was either destroyed or disposed of, and the makeshift weapons were carefully discarded to eliminate any remaining evidence. All 4 individuals involved were now bound by their actions. They had to remain silent. If anyone talked, they all faced serious prison time and, at worst, a possible death sentence. But the group was confident they had committed the perfect crime and that law enforcement would never catch up to them. From the start, Joan had suspected that Irene was in grave danger and had tried to help her. However, she was afraid for her own life and the safety of her son and daughter. When she asked about Irene's whereabouts, Carrie snapped at her, saying she had kicked out that rat and that she wouldn't be coming back. Soon after, Joan noticed Carrie and Cheryl gathering up dirty clothes stained with what looked like dried blood. She also saw a stained chair and a pillow being removed from the trailer. The men loaded all these items into the truck bed and drove off, only to return later that night. Sensing Joan's curiosity, Carrie tried to explain it away, claiming she had cut herself and gotten blood on some things. She also mentioned that she and her boyfriend would be leaving the trailer park soon. The moment the group left, Joan rushed to the nearest payphone and called law enforcement to report a possible crime. Deputy Sheriff David Wilson responded to the call. However, upon arriving, he immediately noted that Joan was under the influence of prohibited substances and, because of this, didn't take her claims seriously from the start. The woman spoke incoherently, trying to explain what she had seen. Suspicious stained items being removed from the trailer, what appeared to be a bloodied pillow lying beneath it that later disappeared, and a screwdriver covered in blood with what looked like bits of skin and hair stuck to it, which also went missing. The deputy sheriff walked around the trailer, shining his flashlight, but aside from some clutter, he didn't find anything suspicious. Even when Joan pointed out a bar of soap with clear bite marks on it, he dismissed it as unimportant and didn't collect it as evidence. Joan also mumbled something about a missing trash bin, but the deputy brushed it off, assuming she was rambling due to being under the influence. After scanning the area one last time, he concluded in his report that there were no signs of a crime inside or around the trailer and deemed Joan's statements unreliable. Meanwhile, Carrie, Cheryl, Mark, and George made sure to dispose of any remaining stained items, the makeshift weapons, and anything else that could be used against them. They also cleaned the vehicle they had used. The group then checked into a cheap roadside motel where they discussed their next move. Mark suggested going back to set the trailer on fire to destroy any potential evidence they might have overlooked. However, they ultimately rejected the idea, fearing it would attract too much attention. No one immediately reported the disappearance of an unemployed woman struggling with substance dependency, so there was no official missing person report. Rumors spread within certain circles, but most assumed she had simply left town. It wasn't until sometime later that a caseworker assisting Irene with her efforts to regain parental rights over her children grew concerned. She knew that Irene was serious about turning her life around and wouldn't have just abandoned the process. But then, Irene missed a scheduled meeting, stopped answering calls, and seemingly vanished. The caseworker found this highly unusual and decided to report it to law enforcement. Even then, the investigation didn't start right away. The delay was caused by Irene's husband, Bobby May, who claimed to have seen her in July 1988, about a month after she was believed to have gone missing. At the time, he had just been released from prison and said he ran into her once. However, he couldn't recall the exact date or location of their meeting, frequently contradicting himself in his statements. Bobby's claims stalled the already slow-moving investigation for another month. Finally, in August of that year, the caseworker took matters into her own hands and visited the trailer park in search of Irene. There, she encountered Joan, who repeated the same disturbing account she had given the deputy months earlier. This time, she also handed over a few items that she believed might still contain traces of blood. Joan asked the caseworker to take them to the police, since no one had believed her before. The caseworker followed through, but once again, law enforcement dismissed the evidence as insignificant, and the case remained at a standstill. It wasn't until late November of that year that the trailer was searched again, but once more, no solid evidence of a crime was found. By the end of 1988, investigators tracked down Cheryl and called her in for questioning, offering her a chance to cooperate as an informant. At first, she denied any involvement and claimed she knew nothing. However, what she didn't realize was that her phone was being monitored. A few months later, she slipped up, mentioning in a conversation that Irene was no longer alive and that her body would never be found. Following this revelation, Baker was arrested and could no longer deny her connection to the case, but there was still no concrete evidence against her. Despite the mention of a possible crime, the investigation continued to move at an unacceptably slow pace, and the search for Irene's remains didn't officially begin until the summer of 1991. The biggest challenge was that no one could pinpoint even a general location where investigators should look. Cheryl mentioned a Native American reservation, but she had no further details. By the early 1990s, forensic technology had advanced, and DNA analysis had become a useful tool, though it was still far from what it is today. Unfortunately, due to the amount of time that had passed, investigators were unable to recover any viable evidence from the trailer. Even the bar of soap with bite marks had been lost by then. In October 1991, Joan was finally brought in for formal questioning. Investigators asked her to identify those involved in Irene's disappearance. She was able to recognize Cheryl, Carrie, and Mark from photographs, but there was no record of George in law enforcement databases. No one knew his last name, and it was likely that even his first name had been fake. In June 1992, 4 years after Irene's disappearance, formal charges were finally filed against Carrie, Mark, and Cheryl, and all three were taken into custody. However, George's true identity remained a mystery. Cheryl quickly agreed to cooperate with the investigation, but attempted to downplay her role in the crime. At first, she claimed she hadn't known who was under the sheet-covered chair and had no idea what Carrie and Mark had planned. Later, she admitted that the couple had forced her to participate in what happened to ensure she wouldn't go to the police. Baker also revealed that Carrie had once tried to convince her to get rid of Mark, saying that if law enforcement ever came after them, they could blame everything on him and claim he had fled. However, Cheryl swore that she had no idea where the men had taken Irene's remains or the makeshift weapons used that night, as she hadn't gone with them. She only had a rough idea of what had happened afterward. During subsequent interrogations, Cheryl provided a detailed account of what had happened to Irene. She claimed that she had wanted to go to the police from the very beginning, but that Carrie had threatened her if she ever spoke out. Investigators also offered Carrie a deal, but she refused, continuing to insist on her innocence. Mark, on the other hand, admitted to some involvement, though only partially. Despite partial confessions from Cheryl and Mark, Carrie denied everything and called their statements fabricated. She was convinced that without a body, a weapon, or solid evidence, she couldn't be convicted. In response, investigators used a strategy. They placed an informant in her jail cell, who managed to get her to talk. However, even this testimony didn't seem strong enough to secure a conviction. The trial didn't begin until early 1995, and the defense attorneys for all three defendants were optimistic. With no physical evidence and Irene's body still missing, they believed they had a strong chance of winning the case. However, the court eventually decided to try Carrie separately from her alleged accomplices. Key witnesses for the prosecution included Joan, the caseworker who had first raised concerns about Irene's disappearance, and one of Carrie's cellmates, to whom she had revealed disturbing details about what had happened to Irene. Meanwhile, the deputy sheriff who had initially responded to Joan's call continued to insist that he had seen no signs of a crime at the trailer and that the only witness at the time had been under the influence. At that point, some still considered the possibility that Irene might be alive, living under a different name in another state. Bobby continued to claim that he had seen her a month after she supposedly vanished. However, his statements were never verified. Additionally, since Irene had a history of legal trouble and prior arrests, her fingerprints were in the system. If she were truly alive, it was likely that she would have surfaced in official records at some point. Another key witness was Carrie's friend, Lori Carlisle. She testified that she had spoken with Carrie shortly after Irene disappeared and that Carrie had gleefully shared disturbing details about what had happened to her. When Lori asked why they had done this to Irene, Carrie reportedly said there were several reasons. First, Irene was suspected of being a police informant, which, in criminal circles, was already considered a serious offense. Second, she had hepatitis, but had continued sharing injection tools with the rest of the group, putting them at risk. Third, she had allegedly stolen jewelry and some furniture from Carrie, and Carrie had wanted revenge. Despite the complexity of the case and the lack of physical evidence, a body or strong forensic proof, all three defendants were convicted in 1996. Cheryl Baker was sentenced to 15 years in prison. Mark Tonkins received 25 years without the possibility of parole. Carrie Dalton, who had been tried separately, was sentenced to death. To this day, Carrie's sentence has not been carried out. She remains on death row, continuing to claim her innocence. Irene's body has never been found, and the identity of the mysterious George remains unknown. Carrie's sister, Victoria, later wrote a book attempting to prove her innocence. She also runs a blog advocating for Carrie, where she shares her own theories about what really happened on June 26, 1988. Thanks for watching, everyone. Your support means a lot to me, and you can help my channel grow by hitting that like button, dropping a comment, and sharing this video. Your engagement really makes a difference. See you soon.